Welcome to the Archive Bader lecture this evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in person. Great crowd tonight and online. For those who don't know me, I'm Amalia Kakissis, the archivist of the BSA, and we have this wonderful sponsored lecture lectureship, from a former archivist or man of many trades, as it were, who was a former student of the school back in the 60s. And that is Father Edward Bader. And that is him there. Finally have a photo. We don't have many photos of him, but a very jolly man. I got to meet him before he passed away and gave a small endowment so we could have this lectureship here at the British School. So the Archives lecture series, as we first started it, started in 2009, and it was a platform to showcase, of course, the research developed here from researchers coming in to read the material we have here in our archives. And in 2014, the series was reconfigured with the help of the Father Edward Bader Endowment to be the archive lectureship. And that allows a researcher to come and stay with us a week and do research, and then to have this lovely event with everyone and hear the outcome of that research. Father Bader, and this is his first year here in 1965. I'll just let go. This is, you'll see him on the big jolly man, the far end of the photo with the group from 1966. Mervyn Popham was assistant director, Jane Ravnitz in the photo, Brony Hankey, a lot of big names that Father Bader was close friends with, actually, until he died. And we actually made these photos for him when he visited. Father Bader was an ordained Catholic priest, and he had an interest in art and archaeology, and he came to the British School for the academic year of 1965-66. For the last 27 years of his life, Father Bader was assigned to the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. He was American, but went to do his degree in Cambridge, where he served as priest, archivist, curator of art and archaeology, and adjunct faculty in the archaeology department there. So a man of many trades, but we had a great cooperation with the friends there of that organization and the school. So this year's Bader Archive Lectureship is Dr. Yoria Flouda. And I will pass it on to our director, Professor Rebecca Sweetman, to tell you a little bit more about Yoria.
So Amalia and I had a fight about who was going to get to introduce Yoria, and guess what? Yeah, it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here, and in particular to welcome Yoria back to the BSA. We have known Yoria for a very, very long time. I'm not going to say in how many years, but since last century and last millennium. So that's a pretty long time. We were together for many, many days and nights in the BSA library writing our PhDs. Yoria undertook her PhD on Mycenaean administrative practices with Professor Correz at the University of Athens, which she completed in 2006. She then went on to have various positions with different efforts in, for example, Thebes and in Achaea, working as a contract archaeologist before securing her job in the Heraklion Museum, where she is to this day. She began working in an involved way in designing and ensuring the completion of the redesign or the reconceptualization of the Minoan material, Minoan gallery collections, and she's now head of department of the Prehistoric and Classical Antiquities. Yoria, in fact, has just returned from China, which she spoke glowingly about earlier on, where she and the team from Heraklion have successfully brought over this amazing exhibition called Daedalus to Beijing, and it may be moving on from there too, but it's quite an innovative project. Georgia has been awarded a number of fellowships to support her work at places such as Princeton and Harvard, and she has wide-ranging interests, which she has published prolifically about, particularly in terms of Bronze Age administration and writing, and one of my favorite sites in Crete, the site of Apesokari as well. And she also has a huge interest in the archaeology, in World War II archaeology, of which is the topic of tonight's paper. Thank you very much, Georgia, and we're really happy to welcome you here.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this very kind introduction and for the invitation. Many greetings and much love to Amalia for inviting me to give this talk tonight. It's a pleasure to come back to the school where I have spent much of my much time during my graduate years. And thank you all for coming to attend my lecture. Archaeological research was used as one of the primary means for supporting the ideology of the Third Reich, which prevailed in Germany from 1933 to 1945. The main protagonists were two Nazi organizations founded exclusively for this purpose with generous funding, the SS Ahnenerbe, Ancestral Heritage, and the Reichsleiter Rosenberg Task Force, which became one of the largest looting organizations of cultural assets in the occupied countries. Both were active in Greece, and several researchers, including Vasilios Petrakos and Alexandra Kankelait, have recently published on them. Nonetheless, in this presentation, I will try to reconstruct through archival testimonies the activity of the Kunstschutz, namely the art protection unit of the Wehrmacht, founded in 1941 after Crete's conquest with Operation Mercury. I will especially focus on a theme that I have been researching in the last 10 years, namely the historical backdrop of these units' institutional establishment and the underlying political contexts in which German and Austrian archaeologists operated. Both aspects are documented through the active service of two young archaeologists who came from an academic environment and were especially recruited for safeguarding cultural heritage. The Austrian August Schörgendorfer, known mainly from the illicit excavations of two Minoan sites in the Mesara, and Ulf Janssen, who served as the first director of the German Archaeological Institute at Athens from 1967 to 1974. I will also examine the involvement of institutional actors affiliated with the German Archaeological Institute and the University of Graz in order to trace the interinstitutional dynamics that influenced heritage policies during the occupation. The primary sources for my research are archival testimonies from the German Archaeological Institutes at Berlin and Athens, the Austrian State Archives, and the Greek Archaeological Service. The German Kunstschutz in Greece, sorry, it keeps jumping. How do I go backwards? So
the tabs are the easiest.
okay.
So cancel. No.
Okay. Okay. The German Kunstschutz was formed in April 1941 as a group of the military administration of the High Army Command in accordance with the principles of the Fourth International Hague Convention. Its main objectives were the prevention of the destruction and looting of antiquities and the restoration of damaged archaeological monuments. In principle, Kunstschutz officers were also expected to function as a link with the Greek Archaeological Directorate, which was supervised by the Greek Ministry of Education. In the case of Greece, these officers were mainly archaeologists conscripted to military service. Most of them had previous long-term connections with the Greek authorities as well. Both chiefs of the unit, namely Hans Ulrich von Schönebeck and Wilhelm Kraicher, had been recommended by Martin Schede, the president of the German Archaeological Institute at Berlin, who had strong links to the Nazi regime. Schede and German foreign ministry officers had also intervened to the SS ancestral heritage so that the subsidiary German institute in Athens, directed by Walter Wrede, was granted almost absolute responsibility for the conduct and supervision of excavations in Greece. Thus, Wrede, a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, became the formal custodian of Greece's heritage and chief policymaker alongside the Kunstschutz. The German occupation of Crete as a result of the airborne invasion in May 1941 provided a strategic opportunity for systematic archaeological research. The few Greek Archaeological Service representatives on the island were struggling to preserve what they had from the depredations of the war. Thankfully, extensive protection measures undertaken at the outbreak of the Greek-Italian War by the effort of Antiquities of Crete, Nikolaos Platon, had shielded the newly built Heraklion Archaeological Museum from looting. On May 25, 1941, Vasilios Theophanidis, substituting for Platon, who was serving in the army, notified the Heraklion Police Department that the museum had been heavily bombed and was at grave risk of being looted. 43 large clay objects, including larnakes and pithoi, were destroyed, and significant structural damage was caused. In late August, Austrian Major General Julius Alfred Rinkel, leader of the 5th Mountain Division, occupied Sir Arthur Evans's Villa Ariadne and the Taverna at Knossos, both properties of the British School at Athens, and established the villa as his headquarters. The head of the Kunstschutz, von Schönebeck, communicated the news to the Rosenberg service through a formal document. Meanwhile, Ringel built air raid shelters in the back garden of Villa Ariadne. Taking advantage of the absence of the Knossos curator, Richard Wyatt Hutchinson, who served in the British General Headquarters at Cairo, Ringel also initiated small-scale illicit excavations in the area of Gypsades in early September. Assisted by some of his guards, he also confiscated archaeological objects from Villa Ariadne and from a locked space near the throne room of the palace, where the stratigraphic museum of the Knossos excavations was based. The reaction of von Schönebeck, who happened to be present, did not produce any results. The two efforts of Cretan Antiquities, Platon and Theophanidis, formally asked the general through an official document sent on September 8 to take measures to protect the antiquities. They stressed that the catalogue of the Stratigraphic Museum had been published in 1933 by the well-known British archaeologist John Pentlebury. A few days afterwards, they protested that the antiquities had been removed from the Stratigraphic Museum following Ringel's own order. they stressed that no archaeological object can be removed from a museum or archaeological collection without an official order from the ministry. They demanded that the ancient objects be placed back in store and that the keys be returned to the Knossos guard, the only competent keeper of the archaeological site. What the two efforts did not know then was that Ringel appropriated the Antiquities because back in July 1941, he had devised a plan with the Austrian professor Arnold Schober for the foundation of a research institute of Crete at Graz University. According to a post-war report by Platon to the Ministry of Education, dated December 1944, which forms our only primary source for the looting, many objects from the Stratigraphic Museum and an unspecified number of antiquities from the Villa Ariadne, including a headless Roman statue, were airlifted to Graz. Only one wooden crate containing antiquities was returned to Heraklion. Some of the objects were destined for Ringel's villa, and others were to be dispatched soon to Austrian museums as spoils of war. Only 26 of the looted antiquities were repatriated by the University of Graz to the Heraklion Museum and exhibited there in 2017. The plan for a Cretan Research Institute at the University of Graz was supported by the Nazi Minister of Education, Bernhard Rust, and included the participation of Professor Fritz Schachermair, a member of the Nazi Party since 1933. Wrede, the director of the German Institute, reacted intensely, since this would violate the status quo of the German Institute of Athens as the official representative of the Third Reich. In a letter addressing Wrede's concerns, Professor Sober recommended his student Schörgendorfer as a competent archaeologist who could be dispatched to Crete to direct Ringel's excavations and actively engage with the safeguarding of antiquities on the island. Along with Schörgendorfer, who was incorporated in the Cretan Kunstschutz by Ringel, Ulf Janssen, a classical archaeologist, was attached to the commander of Fortress Crete to serve as the sole officer in charge of the Cretan Kunstschutz. Both had been politically active, but followed different paths. The son of the academic art historian Hans Janssen, Ulf Janssen took part in the German Archaeological Institute excavations at Olympia Samos in 1937 and worked as a dedicated assistant to Walter Wrede until 1939. Although he had joined the Nazi Party, he ultimately left it due to his wife's wishes, as he later claimed in a publication. In a recent paper, Alexandra Kankelait discusses that Janssen, in his post-war memoirs, describes how he and Wilhelm Kraicher prevented a looted statue from the Hieron at Samos to reach Germany as an act of heroism, without much self-reflection on their role as former representatives of the German occupiers. In contrast to Janssen, Schörgendorfer's humble social background may have encouraged him to become an extreme right student, as revealed by his membership of the Austrian totalitarian movement Fatherland Front from 1934. His decision to ally himself with the Fatherland Front may also have been driven by the fact that under the authoritarian dictatorship of Engelbert Dollfuss, Only members of this party could advance into university positions. During his studies at the School of Philosophy of the University of Graz, under Professor Schober, Schörgendorfer also became involved in the local Catholic student fraternity of Graz that was sympathetic to the Austrian fascist regime. His allegiance to the Austrian Fascist Party, which actually opposed the annexation of Austria by Germany, ideologically contradicted his later membership of the Sturmabteilung, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. His military service card records that Schörgendorfer joined the Sturmabteilung in March 1938. He had by then apparently renounced his prior political affiliations, considered them as unacceptable by the new ruling National Socialist regime in Austria, so that he could advance professionally and enter the officer ranks through the Sturmabteilung. His appointment as the academic assistant to Schober for the duration of his military service from December 1940 until November 1945 ensured that Schörgendorfer participated in influential networks at the University of Graz. So, despite his lack of practical excavation experience, on October 14, 1941, he was admitted as a junior officer of the Kunstschutz unit formed on Crete. Documentation and visual cues provided by a previously unpublished linen-bound photo album kept by him during his service on Crete, kindly offered by his late wife in 2010 as a primary source for his excavation at Apesokari, helps to reconstruct his and Janssen's activity on Crete. From late October in early December 1941, the two archaeologists ran an illicit excavation on Ringel's orders. This took place without prior approval from the Archaeological Service or the German Institute. With a team of Greek captives, they explored part of a Roman house behind the little palace at Knossos, in the layers above the northern end of the unexcavated Minoan unexplored mansion. It is not specified whether these were conscripted Cretan workmen or Greek military prisoners of war. Platon immediately informed the Greek Ministry of Education of this illicit excavation and specified that, as orally stated by the excavators, the purpose of the excavation was to reveal Minoan buildings, which supposedly lie in the deeper strata. Nonetheless, a post-war report by the representative of the British school, Thomas Dunbabin, confirms the claim of the two officers that they intentionally did not penetrate deeper than the Roman stratum in order to protect the site until Ringel should order them to stop. In parallel with the excavation, they undertook urgent repairs to shield the Heraklion Archaeological Museum from bomb damage, as documented by the third report on the activity of the Kunstschutz in Heraklion, and also by a photo of the museum included in Schörgendorfer's photo album. Most of the antiquities still lay in the museum's underground shelter, where Platon had hidden them under sandbags before the beginning of the war. Nonetheless, the entrance to the shelter was cleared following the orders of the two Kunstschutz representatives, and the billeting of troops at the museum was limited. Most importantly, the German commander of the airport was persuaded to release 2 out of the 4 museum galleries that had been seized by the Luftwaffe. This development was probably a step aiming at the reinstallation of the exhibits and the reopening of the museum, for which the Kunstschutz was pressing Nikolaus Platon. Schörgendorfer had meanwhile been promoted to lieutenant and upgraded to an officer of the Kunstschutz with the main task to supervise Ringel's excavation. However, the German Archaeological Institute forcefully reacted to the aspirations of Ringel and Sober to initiate research projects on Crete. Wrede tried to detach the classical archaeologist Gabriel Welter from his military service in Aegina and sent him to Crete to safeguard urgent scientific German interests, as stated. After his effort failed, this role was finally undertaken by the well-known prehistorian Friedrich Matz Jr. As reported to President Schede on 12 November 1941, Matz joined von Schönebeck on a mission to Crete in order to oversee the excavation at Knossos. Wrede joined them later. Finally, in an effort to impose institutional control over the Wehrmacht, Matz and von Schönebeck agreed that the German Archaeological Institute should thereafter supervise any excavations and thoroughly publish the excavation reports. Still, Nikolaus Platon could not personally supervise the illicit excavation because Matz and Wrede, both adherents of the National Socialist status quo, on visiting the excavation, stated that it was run by General Ringel. Matz also made exploratory field trips looking for possible excavation sites in central and eastern Crete, accompanied by Wrede, Schönebeck, Schörgendorfer, and Janssen. A series of official documents and letters from representatives of the German Institute to various political and scientific figures reveal that the responsibilities of the Kunstschutz were gradually placed under the absolute control of the German Institute. Schörgendorfer's archaeological activity on Crete was meant to be finally institutionalized through a letter addressed by Bernhard Rust, the Minister of Education, to General Alexander André, who had meanwhile replaced Ringel. Rust prioritized selecting a new significant excavation travel target. He stipulated that Schörgendorfer, Janssen, and Ernst Kirsten, a professor at the University of Heidelberg, who was then serving in the Luftwaffe, be involved. The correspondence between Minister Rust, Wrede, and the Kunstschutz notably gives the impression impression that the latter primarily functioned as a closed circle of archaeologists driven by scientific ambitions. So, from February to April 1942, Schörgendorfer acted as the officer in charge with Heraklion as his basis. He had a series of duties documented by the 2 surviving reports of the Kunstschutz: the reinstallation and safety of the museums at Chania, Rethymno, and Heraklion, the surveillance of excavated archaeological sites across the island, as well as the safeguarding of occasional finds discovered through building operations or under private ownership. Photos in his personal album, which have been arranged by him in chronological order, help to infer which sites and monuments in central and eastern Crete he inspected in person. For example, snapshots of important Venetian monuments of Heraklion reflect his concerns for the preservation of the city's heritage. Photos of St. Minas Cathedral, the modern squatter houses built in the moat and on the parapet of the Venetian walls after the 1935 earthquake of Heraklion, as well as the old cemetery of German soldiers, now destroyed, document his curiosity or interest in the modern city and in the legacy of the Wehrmacht, respectively. Moreover, a report submitted in March 1942 describes a month of intense activity for the archaeologist. He inspected the Heraklion Museum and the sites of Festos, Αγία Τριάδα, Τίλισσος, Λίτος, Αμνησός, Χερσόνησος, Νιρουχάνη, Μάλια, Γουρνιά, and Ιεράπετρα. He documented the theft of equipment and antiquities from the excavation storeroom at Amnisos, which had taken place in the autumn of 1941, and he recorded the missing artifacts. Among the latter was an important inscription mentioning the name of the goddess Ilithia, which will be published by my colleague Kleanthis Sidiropoulos. At Chersonissos, Schörgendorfer recorded fragments of architraves, capitals, metopes, and various inscriptions, as well as 3 Roman headless marble statues, one of which bore the inscription Museu. Although Schörgendorfer transported all these ancient pieces to a local school intended ultimately to be occupied by a military reconnaissance unit, there is no follow-up in reports about their final storage at the museum in Heraklion or elsewhere. The inscribed statue could be missing since it has not been documented subsequently in archaeological literature. A general shot of Chersonissos, illustrated in his album, also shows part of a small excavation site that cannot be precisely identified. Still, some of his reconnaissance trips to the countryside likely aimed at identifying potential post-war excavation projects aligned with the objectives set by Minister Rust. Schörgendorfer's account suggests that he was accompanied on his trip to East Central Crete by Walter Jelinek, the government building assessor of the Luftwaffe squadron established at the nearby airfield of Castelli. Schörgendorfer's inspection of ancient Litos, one of the most prosperous Roman cities in Crete, is recorded in 2 landscape photos. His special interest lay in the city's connection to the port of Chersonissos and in its active participation in Roman wine trading networks. This presented great research potential in the mid-1940s because the development of Roman imperial Litos was not yet documented architecturally owing to limited archaeological investigations. This has been confirmed by the recent ongoing excavations of the site. Regarding 2 Roman headless marble statues from the site, Schörgendorfer reported that it was hard to protect them because they had been used as light stands in a nearby church. This could have been one of the 2 churches founded over earlier basilicas, namely Agios Georgios or Timios Stavros. The archaeologist also recorded that he could not trace the inscription stones mentioned to him by the Ephor Nikolaos Platon. Moreover, between 11th and 21st of May 1942, Schörgendorfer also conducted an exploration of West Crete. The formal proposal submitted by him finally included a topography of Knossos exploration project, test excavations at the sites of Aptera and Chersonissos, and research at the sites of Monastiraki Harakas and Apodoulou Gournes in the Amari Valley. The last two sites were originally investigated by John Pentlebury. He additionally applied for permission to excavate at Chersonissos, a project suited to his specialization in Roman and early medieval archaeology. Although Schörgendorfer's proposal was enthusiastically received by Minister Rust, Janssen expressed objections, as revealed by his letter to the military authorities. He particularly evaluated Schörgendorfer's assessment of the excavation at Knossos as the most urgent and successful exploration which has to be undertaken by the German scientists, as politically incorrect and potentially inconclusive. Finally, Gabriel Welter was sent to Crete in the summer of 1942 as representative of the German Institute. As discussed in detail by Katja Sporn, this happened despite the reservations of Vrede and Matz, as Welter had been accused of stealing antiquities from a storeroom of the Aegina excavations. The fact that Schede, the president of the German Archaeological Institute at Berlin, initially considered Schörgendorfer along with Schachermair for the position of leading post-war excavators of Crete, underlines the dynamics of interinstitutional politics and possibly the political connections of Welter. After long negotiations, General André finally agreed to settle upon a project of small-scale excavations run under the scientific supervision of the German Archaeological Institute and the direction of Welter. According to this project, Janssen, Kraiker, Kirsten, and Welter started conducting excavations in the prefectures of Chania and Rethymno. The German Institute thus departed from its prior policy to ask for excavation permits from the Greek state, whose representatives in vain tried to supervise. Besides, Schörgendorfer had already started excavating the partly looted Tholos Tomb A at Apesokari in April 1942. This excavation was justified as a decision of General André to initiate an excavation project on behalf of the Kunstschutz. An unpublished report by the local guard of antiquities at Gortin clarifies that he was not allowed to supervise. One of the 3 consecutive sheets of photos in Schörgendorfer's album features 4 staged photographs of the archaeologist with the family of the house's owner, whom he had appropriated the house from, alongside Wehrmacht soldiers in the house's courtyard. 2 soldiers of the Wehrmacht, as well as a local villager and his son, who are also depicted in the previous photos, helped to excavate the burial chamber and the intact built annexes before the entrance of the Tholos tomb. A few months later, Schörgendorfer's second request for excavation in Chersonissos was rejected by Welter. Urged by him to rush and deprived of the necessary resources, including a draftsman, Schörgendorfer managed to complete in September 1942 the excavation of a large Minoan building complex on Vigla Hill. 2 excavation reports by him were included along with the rest of Kunstschutz's excavations in a collective volume published by the German Archaeological Institute. Two documents by Platon, which served as primary sources for the post-war report Damage to Antiquities from the War and the Occupation Armies, as well as the corresponding report by the British Allies, signed by Tom Dunbabin, indicate that Schörgendorfer adhered to archaeological ethics, ensuring that all excavation finds were handed over to the Heraklion Museum. This facilitated the re-evaluation of the site and the publication of all finds from Apesokari by the speaker and her collaborators in 2023, 70 years after the excavation was completed. However, the majority of the finds from the excavations of West Crete are still missing today. This fact justifies the inclusion of von Schönebeck, Kraiger, and Kirsten in the reports and red flag names list issued by the Art Looting Intelligence Unit of the US Office of Strategic Services in 1945 and 1946 regarding the theft of art objects. But what was the fate of the Cretan Kunstschutz? By the end of 1942, it was gradually dissolved as the assignments of key officers, Schörgendorfer and Janssen on Crete, came to an end, with Bonn being reassigned elsewhere. The reasons behind this outcome remained unclear to me on the basis of the available archival evidence until Gabriele Koiner and Heinrike Dudumas published a study on a series of letters shared by Schörgendorfer, Sober, and other personalities. These documents suggest that Gabriel Welter's actions were the catalyst for Schörgendorfer's return to the front, followed shortly by Janssen's reassignment, and ultimately the abrupt dissolution of the Kunstschutz on Crete. Further research by Katja Sporn has clarified that Welter was already back on Aegina in November 1942. To the distress of the president of the German Archaeological Institute, the entire Crete operation was abruptly ended on account of military reasons due to the winter. So, let us revisit the evidence presented in an effort to trace the lasting implication of the Wehrmacht's archaeological activities on Cretan archaeology. The comparative study of archival materials sheds light on von Schönebeck's administrative role as head of the Kunstschutz and on the complexities of cultural preservation under military auspices. It reveals the extent of Ringel's and Andres' authority over the actions of the Kunstschutz representatives from 1941 to 1942. It shows that the relationship between the scientific personnel and the military was not always governed by professional standards, as evidenced by the illicit excavation at Knossos, carried out under Ringel's orders by Janssen and Schörgendorfer. Furthermore, an unpublished document by Platon, dated August 6, 1943, and kept in the BSA archive, documents the losses sustained by the British School Library at Knossos and outlines the efforts made by the Greek state to preserve the archaeological site. Although the Kunstschutz played a role in safeguarding Crete's ancient heritage, its legacy is complicated by the fact that its efforts also served propaganda functions within the broader context of the Nazi occupation. The main objective of all involved parties was to initiate significant excavations that could solidify their presence on the island through long-term projects intended for the post-war era. However, these initiatives were also shaped by the personal academic interests and ambitions of the archaeologists involved, hence the underlying tensions between Welter, Schörgendorfer, and Janssen. Despite these individual motivations, the excavations primarily functioned as tools for the occupying forces' cultural legitimation. They also aligned with the Wehrmacht's broader strategy of conducting archaeological explorations across all occupied European territories. It also remains unclear to what extent the specific excavators aimed to engage with theoretical concepts promoted by Nazi propaganda, such as Aryan supremacy and the debates over migration versus racial autochthony. Given that all relevant preliminary publications were released in 1951, they may have been influenced by the denazification process, which sought to purge any remnants of Nazism from public life and intellectual discourse. In any case, the fact that all excavations were not properly published in the post-war era has deprived Cretan archaeology of important scholarly sources, particularly relating to West Crete. To sum up, this analysis has highlighted a unique balance of power in the control of cultural heritage, whereby the director of the German Archaeological Institute effectively shared responsibility with the Kunstschutz. Together, these organizations supplanted the institutional officers of the Greek Archaeological Service, acting under the doctrine of sovereignty. This objective evidence of the violation of customary Greek archaeological law regarding excavation permissions reinforces the view that archaeology is never practiced in a neutral social context. On the contrary, it assumes a political dimension shaped by prevailing political conditions and the identities of those who carry it out. The involvement of archaeologists in military operations or their cooperation with armed forces during periods of war or political instability can only reinforce the law of the strongest, as shown by recent military conflicts in the Near East over the past 2 decades. Nevertheless, for a balanced and comprehensive assessment of the role of the Kunstschutz in Crete, the positive contributions of Schörgendorfer and Janssen to the protection of various archaeological sites must also be acknowledged. But above all, I would like to stress that this remains a dynamic field of research. Future archival discoveries may yet alter our understanding of the extent to which the archaeologists of the Kunstschutz and other institutional actors shaping heritage policy were politicized or aligned with the radical ideology of the Third Reich. Thank you very much for your attention.